February 1946, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Winter wind scraped across the prairie as the morning bell rang inside the mess hall. Hundreds of German prisoners of war sat at the long wooden tables, but none reached for their food. Guards would later report something they had never encountered before in any camp: a hunger strike, not to escape captivity, but to avoid being sent home. What exactly happened at Camp Concordia in 1946 varies depending on which surviving documents and testimonies you read. So, this retelling stays within what historians widely agree on. There were protests, there were petitions, and in several camps across the United States, German POWs pleaded not to be repatriated after the war, fearing the destruction and uncertainty awaiting them in Europe. This is the story, sanitized for accuracy, safe for platforms, and grounded in documented history, of what some historians call the American captivity paradox. How life in captivity defied expectations. When German soldiers were captured in North Africa and Europe between 1943 and 1945, many expected harsh treatment. Nazi propaganda had warned troops that Allied captivity meant cruelty or death. Instead, most were surprised. Historically verified facts. The United States held more than 400,000 German POWs in over 500 camps nationwide. Camps were legally required to follow the 1929 Geneva Convention, and the U.S. military, while not perfect, generally complied. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and opportunities for recreation. POW labor programs were legal under the Geneva Convention as long as prisoners were not used in war-related industries. Many former POWs later recalled being struck by the relative abundance of food, access to sports, music, libraries, and, most importantly, day-to-day contact with regular Americans. Some camps even had theater groups, volunteer orchestras, educational programs, camp newspapers, all monitored by the military. None of this means conditions were ideal everywhere. Not all camps were equal, and not every guard followed the rules. But compared with conditions in wartime Europe, the contrast was dramatic. The work program that changed everything because millions of U.S. men were overseas, farms across the country faced a severe labor shortage. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were allowed to do non-military labor, and so tens of thousands were sent in small supervised work detachments to farms, orchards, lumber operations, and local businesses. This is where many attitudes changed. American families, often initially wary, came to see individual prisoners as ordinary young men. Some prisoners learned English from farm families, spent holidays with them, or maintained correspondence after the war. The War Department monitored fraternization and technically discouraged it, but in rural communities it was difficult to prevent occasional friendships from forming. Not all experiences were warm, but many were. And for German POWs whose homes had been bombed or whose families had been displaced, America began to feel strangely safer than the homeland they left behind. The war ends and a new fear begins. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, POWs expected rapid release. Instead, they were held for months as the Allied powers decided how to manage the return of millions of former soldiers. Under international law, the POWs did have to be sent home eventually, but home no longer resembled home. Germany's cities had been heavily destroyed by years of bombing. Food shortages were widespread. Housing was scarce. Many families were missing or dead. The prisoners knew this through letters that had delayed their way across the Atlantic, when the letters managed to arrive at all. By late 1945 and early 1946, the U.S. government announced that all remaining German POWs would be repatriated. That's when the protests began. The petitions across multiple U.S. camps, groups of POWs drafted polite, formal petitions asking to remain in America, not as free citizens, but simply to continue working until conditions in Germany stabilized, what historians confirm. Several camps produced petitions. Prisoners cited fears of famine, homelessness, and political instability. The U.S. government rejected every request, citing the Geneva Convention's requirement for repatriation. Some American farmers and local officials even sent letters supporting the prisoners, saying they were dependable workers and asking whether special exceptions could be made. These requests were also denied. The War Department's logic was simple. If the U.S. kept German POWs voluntarily, it might violate international law and set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. The hunger strikes and acts of protest. The extent of protests varied from camp to camp. Not all prisoners resisted, and not all camps documented hunger strikes, but historians agree that some groups staged work slowdowns, some refused food for short periods. Some tried legal channels, hiring American lawyers with their earned camp currency. Most simply expressed fear and sadness at being forced to leave. Nothing changed the outcome. By the summer of 1946, nearly all POWs had been transferred to ships bound for Europe. The decision to send the prisoners home might sound simple on paper, but in reality, it collided with fear, grief, and the emotional bonds created during years of captivity. The day the orders arrived in January 1946, official notices began arriving at camps across the United States. All remaining German POWs were to be repatriated as quickly as transportation allowed. The reasoning was straightforward. International law required release once hostilities ended. The U.S. military needed to demobilize and shut down hundreds of temporary camps. America did not want to set an international precedent of keeping foreign soldiers after a war ended, but the prisoners did not receive this announcement with relief. In many camps, guards later recalled a sudden and eerie quiet. Men who had spent years playing soccer in the yards, writing home, learning English, or working in the fields, suddenly moved slowly, spoke less, and avoided the future. For some, Germany had ceased to exist as they remembered it. Their towns, families, and even borders had changed. What home looked like in 1946? To understand their fear, you need to understand the Germany of early 1946, not in sensational terms, but in the way historians broadly agree. Housing was critically damaged in many cities. Food shortages were widespread in the first years after the war. Transportation systems were barely functioning. Millions of civilians were displaced, especially in eastern regions affected by border changes. Letters from family members, when they arrived at all, often contained vague statements. The house is gone. We are staying with relatives. We do not know when the next delivery of food will come. These letters were monitored by censors, so prisoners rarely received detailed descriptions, but the tone alone was enough. And for those whose homes were now within the Soviet occupation zone, the fear was even greater. They had no way of knowing whether they would be viewed with suspicion after spending years in the West. The protests spread. Not every camp saw organized resistance. Not every prisoner protested. But enough incidents were documented across multiple states to show a clear pattern. 1. Hunger strikes. Some groups refused food for brief periods to protest their repatriation. These strikes were peaceful and usually short-lived, but they deeply alarmed camp officials unaccustomed to that kind of demonstration. 2. Petitions. Many POWs wrote formally worded requests addressed to the U.S. War Department, the State Department, President Harry Truman, or even the United Nations, which had barely begun functioning. These petitions did not ask for full citizenship. Most simply asked for one of three things: permission to continue working temporarily, permission to live under supervision as non-citizens, permission to stay until their families could confirm living arrangements in Germany. All were respectfully written. All were denied. 3. Slowdowns. Some work detachments began performing tasks slowly. Farmers who had grown close to the prisoners sometimes wrote in support, saying the workers were reliable and needed. 4. Emotional appeals. Chaplain logs, guard letters, and camp reports describe men asking officers whether they could be released inside the U.S., whether an American family could sponsor them, whether marriage to an American citizen would change their status, or whether they could stay as indentured workers. The answer was always the same. International law required repatriation. The Guards conflict. American Guards found themselves in a rare situation without precedent. These were the same soldiers who had fought Germany only a few years earlier. Many had family members who died in Europe. Yet after years stationed at these camps, their relationship with the prisoners was often surprisingly human. A number of guards later said the same thing in interviews and memoirs. It didn't feel like guarding the enemy anymore. Some guards played sports with prisoners. Others taught them English or learned German from them. Some supervised work teams daily for months or years. By 1946, the difference between captor and captive had blurred in countless personal ways. So the guards experienced the repatriation orders with complicated emotions. They were soldiers, they followed orders, but many privately sympathized with the men they were escorting out. The final days of the camps. As spring turned into summer, camps began shutting down one by one. The process usually followed a similar pattern. 1. Medical checks to ensure prisoners were fit for travel. 2. Final inspections. Personal belongings were cataloged. Identification documents were updated. 3. Marching orders. Groups were assembled according to transportation schedules. 4. Transport to rail lines. Guards escorted prisoners to trains bound for East Coast or Gulf Coast ports. 5. Loading onto ships. Many traveled on repurposed Liberty ships or troop carriers. The prisoners brought little with them, a kit bag, some personal letters, perhaps a handmade keepsake from the camp workshops. In several communities, Americans lined the fences or gathered near the gates to say goodbye. This is one of the most surprising and well-documented elements of the story. Ordinary Americans showing up at dawn to watch columns of German POWs march out for the last time. A few even brought small gifts, bread, fruit, written addresses, or photographs. For a country that had recently fought a brutal war against Germany, such scenes are striking. The journey back, the voyage back to Europe, could take several weeks, depending on the port, weather, and logistics. Prisoners were not returning to front lines or battlefields. They were returning to a defeated, divided, and deeply wounded nation, and they knew it. Some wrote final letters from the ship, hoping to reconnect with families whose fates were uncertain. Others simply stared at the Atlantic, silent. One American officer involved in a transport operation later described the atmosphere. They were not celebrating. They were not relieved. They looked like men traveling toward a future they could not imagine. Arrival in Europe. Once ships reached European ports, the returning soldiers passed through processing centers operated by the Allied occupation authorities. What happened next varied widely depending on which zone they originated from, where their families lived, whether they had political affiliations, and the simple luck of geography. Some were home within days. Others wandered for months before finding surviving relatives. Still others discovered that nothing was left. No house, no town, sometimes no surviving family. There were no guarantees and no way back to America. Why none of them could stay? It is important to emphasize this clearly for accuracy. The United States could not legally allow German POWs to remain, even if it wanted to. Under the rules of the time, POWs must be returned to their country of origin once hostilities ended. Keeping them voluntarily would have violated international agreements. Allowing some to stay would require allowing all to apply, potentially hundreds of thousands. Immigration law at the time made special exceptions nearly impossible. Even American families who supported the prisoners could not override federal law. The emotional reality. What made this entire episode so remarkable was not that men missed captivity, no one wants to be a prisoner, but that circumstances had created a strange, paradoxical truth. For some German POWs, the world beyond the barbed wire felt more frightening than the world inside it. Inside the camps they had food, structure, work, safety, friendships, clarity. Outside lay uncertainty, hunger, rubble, and a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left behind. They were not resisting freedom, they were resisting what awaited them on the other side of freedom. When the last transports left U.S. soil in 1946, it seemed like the end of the story, but it wasn't. The true epilogue unfolded not on American farms or inside the camps, but in the rubble of Germany, in the letters exchanged across the ocean, and in the lives of the men who swore they would someday return. This is the part history nearly forgot. Life after repatriation. When former prisoners stepped back onto German soil, they encountered a homeland carved into 4 occupation zones and transformed beyond recognition. Some found their families, battered but alive. Others returned to empty foundations where houses once stood. Many discovered that parents, siblings, wives, or children had disappeared in the chaos of evacuation and shifting borders. Their years in America, years that once felt like a detour, suddenly became among the most stable years of their young lives. And this created a strange emotional split. Germany was home. America felt like the place where they had grown into adults. Many carried American habits. They tied their shoes differently, used American phrases, drank coffee the American way, or tried recreating camp recipes using whatever ingredients they could find. Some tried to tell neighbors and relatives about the United States, its food, its vastness, its people. But in a starving, devastated country, these stories often sounded unbelievable or even suspicious. For years, they kept quiet. Letters across the Atlantic. Although they were gone, the relationships formed in captivity did not always end. Former POWs wrote letters to American farmers, guards, chaplains, teachers from the camp schools, and even local families who had unofficially befriended them. Mail traveled slowly. Some letters took months. Many never arrived. But these exchanges built the first small threads of post-war German-American reconciliation. More than one American family said the same thing. We thought of him as one of our own boys. And on the German side, they treated us like human beings when the world was falling apart. These letters later became the seeds of something extraordinary. The return that seemed impossible. At first, the idea of returning to the U.S. was unrealistic. Post-war immigration laws were strict, and Germany was still under Allied administration. But by the late 1940s and early 1950s, conditions shifted. The U.S. needed workers again during the post-war boom. West Germany stabilized and became a key Western ally. Immigration quotas gradually loosened. And so, in the early 1950s, something remarkable happened. Former German POWs began immigrating back to the United States, willingly, legally, and proudly. Not hundreds of thousands, but a meaningful number. Some returned alone, others returned with wives and children. A few were even sponsored by the same farmers they had worked for as prisoners. One former POW wrote decades later, "I came back not as a captive, but as a free man, and America felt familiar in a way I could never explain." Another wrote, "Those years behind barbed wire changed the direction of my life more than the war itself." Marriages and unlikely friendships. A surprising number of former POWs married American women they had met only briefly or through correspondence. In many cases, the women were daughters of farmers or townspeople who had interacted with the camps. Because marriage between a U.S. citizen and a former enemy soldier was politically sensitive in the late 1940s, some couples met again years later, after immigration laws changed, and married then. These marriages helped anchor entire German communities in states like Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Minnesota, Nebraska, Georgia, and others where large camps once operated. Some of the descendants of these marriages live in those towns today. Many don't even know that their grandfather first came to America as a POW. Why the story disappeared despite its emotional weight, this episode almost vanished from public memory. There are several historically grounded reasons. 1. Germany was focused on rebuilding with cities in ruins and millions displaced. Remembering time spent in POW camps simply wasn't a priority. 2. Former POWs feared being misunderstood. Talking openly about well-treated captivity while neighbors starved could be seen as insensitive or disloyal. 3. Americans quickly moved on from the camps. The camps were temporary. As soon as they closed, the land returned to farms, schools, or development. Within a year or two, there were no physical traces. 4. Politically, both countries wanted to look forward. The Cold War was beginning. Public focus shifted toward cooperation, not dwelling on wartime captivity. 5. Narratives of brutality dominated collective memory. The most documented wartime atrocities dwarfed any attention given to humane treatment stories, even though those stories mattered deeply to the individuals who lived them. For decades, the only people who remembered were the former prisoners, the American families who met them, and the guards who saw the paradox unfold. It wasn't until historians rediscovered camp newspapers, letters, and oral histories in the 1980s and 1990s that the story reemerged. The men who never forgot. In the late 20th century, former German POWs began holding reunions, both in Germany and in America. Men who had been enemies in their youth now stood together as elderly friends. One former POW speaking at a reunion said, "We lost the war, but in captivity we found pieces of our humanity that the war had taken." Another, visiting the American farm where he once worked as a prisoner, simply stood in silence for several minutes before saying, "I learned here what it meant to start over." Some brought their children or grandchildren to show them the place where their lives had pivoted, where tragedy had unexpectedly opened a door to a new future. The legacy today, historians highlight the German POW experience in the United States as a complex chapter of wartime history, an example of the Geneva Convention shaping real human lives, and an early spark of post-war reconciliation between two former enemies. It is not a story of heroism or cruelty. It is a story of ordinary people on both sides of a war discovering each other's humanity under the strangest circumstances imaginable. The American guards, the farmers, the chaplains, the POWs who feared freedom beyond the wire, the letters that crossed oceans, the men who eventually came back, the families that exist today because two nations chose, for once, to treat each other's sons humanely. It is a quiet story, but one worth remembering.